Perception of space, depth, and distance. The visual field or surface in which things exist, move, or can be placed is called space. The space in which we live is organized in three dimensions. We perceive not only the spatial attributes, for example, size, shape, direction, of various objects, but also the distance between the objects found in this space. While the images of objects projected onto our retina are flat and two dimensional, left, right, up, down, we still perceive three we still perceive three dimensions in the space. Why does it happen so? It occurs due to our ability to transfer a two-dimensional retinal vision into a three-dimensional perception. The process of viewing the world in three dimensions is called distance or depth perception. Depth perception is important in our daily life. For example, when we drive, we use depth to assess the distance of an approaching automobile, or when we decide to call a person walking down the street, we determine the loudness with which to call. In perceiving depth, in perceiving depth, we depend on two main sources of information called cues. One is called binocular cues because they require both eyes. Another is called monocular cues because they allow us to perceive depth with just one eye. A number of such cues are used to change a two-dimensional image into a three-dimensional perception. Relative size. The size of retinal image allows us to judge distance based on our past and present experience with similar objects. As the objects get away, the retinal image becomes smaller and smaller. We tend to perceive an object farther away when it appears small and closer when it appears bigger. Interposition or overlapping. These cues occur when some portion of the object is covered by another object. The overlapped object is considered farther away, whereas the object that covers it appears nearer. Linear perspective. This reflects a phenomenon by which distant objects appear to be closer together than the nearer objects. For example, parallel lines such as rail tracks appear to converge with increasing distance, with a vanishing point at the origin. The more the lines converge, the farther away they appear. Aerial perspective. The air contains microscopic particles of dust and moisture that make distant objects look hazy or blurry. This effect is called aerial perspective. For example, distant mountains appear blue due to the scattering of blue light in the atmosphere, whereas the same mountains are perceived to be closer when the atmosphere is clear. Light and shade. In the light, some parts of the object get highlighted, whereas some parts become darker. Highlights and shadows provide us with information about an object's distance. Relative height. Larger objects are perceived as being closer to the viewer and smaller objects as being farther away. When we expect two objects to be the same size and they are not, the larger of the two will appear closer and the smaller will appear farther away. Texture gradient. Texture gradient, it represents a phenomenon by which the visual field having more density of elements is seen farther away. Motion parallax. It is a kinetic monocular cue and hence not considered as a pictorial cue. It occurs when objects at different distances move at a different relative speed. The distant objects appear to move slowly than the objects that are close. The rate of an object's movement provides a cue to its distance. For example, when we travel in a bus, closer objects move against the direction of the bus, whereas the farther objects move with the direction of the bus. Binocular cues, physiological cues. Some important cues to depth perception in three-dimensional space are provided by both the eyes. Three of them have particularly been found to be interesting. Retinal or binocular disparity. Retinal disparity occurs because the two eyes have different locations in our head. They are separated from each other horizontally by a distance of about 6.5 centimeters. Because of this distance, the image formed on the retina of each eye of the same object is slightly different. This difference between the two images is called retinal disparity. The brain interprets a large retinal disparity to mean a close object and a small retinal disparity to mean a distant object, as the disparity is less for distant objects and more for the near objects. Convergence. When we see a nearby object, our eyes converge inwards in order to bring the image on the fovea of each eye. A group of muscles send messages to the brain regarding the degree to which eyes are turning inward, and these messages are interpreted as cues to the perception of depth. The degree of convergence decreases as the object moves further away from the observer. You can experience convergence by holding a finger in front of your nose and slowly bringing it closer. The more your eyes turn inward or converge, the nearer the object appears in space. Accommodation. Accommodation refers to a process by which we focus the image on the muscles on the accommodation refers to a process by which we focus the image on the retina with the help of ciliary muscle. These muscles change the thickness of the lens of the eye. If the object gets away more than 2 meters, the muscle is relaxed. As the object moves nearer, the muscle contracts and the thickness of the lens increases. The signal about the degree of contraction of the muscle is sent to the brain, which provides the cue for distance. Perceptual constancies. The sensory information that we receive from our environment constantly changes as we move around. Yet we form a stable perception of an object seen from any position and in any intensity of light. Perception of the objects as relatively Perception of the objects as relatively stable in spite of changes in the stimulation of sensory receptors is called perceptual constancy. Here we will examine three types of perceptual constancies that we commonly experience in our visual domain. Size constancy. The size of an image on our retina changes with the change in the distance of the object from the eye. The further away it is, the smaller is the image. On the other hand, our experience shows that within limits the object appears to be about the same size irrespective of its distance. For example, when we approach our friend from a distance, our perception of the friend's size does not change much despite the fact that the retinal image on retina becomes larger. This tendency for the perceived size of objects to remain relatively unchanged with changes in their distance from the observer and the size of the retinal image is called size constancy. Shape constancy. In our perceptions, the shapes of familiar objects remain unchanged despite changes in the pattern of retinal image resulting from differences in their orientation. For example, a dinner plate looks the same shape whether the image that it casts on the retina is a circle or an ellipse or roughly a short line. If the plate is viewed from the edge, it is also called form constancy. Brightness constancy. Visual objects not only appear constant in their shape and size, they also appear constant in their degree of whiteness, grayness, or blackness, even though the amount of physical energy reflected from them changes considerably. In other words, our experience of brightness does not change in spite of the changes in the amount of reflected light reaching our eyes. The tendency to maintain apparent brightness constant under different amount of illumination is called brightness constancy. For example, surface of a paper which appears white in the sunlight is still perceived as white in the room light. Similarly, coal that looks black in the sun also looks black in room light. Illusions. Our perceptions are not always veridical. Sometimes we fail to interpret the sensory information correctly. This results in a mismatch between the physical stimuli and its perception. These misperceptions resulting from misinterpretation of information received by our sensory organs are generally known as illusions. These are experienced more or less by all of us. They result from an external stimulus situation and generate the same kind of experience in each individual. That is why illusions are also called primitive organizations. Although illusions can be experienced by the stimulation of any of our senses, psychologists have studied them more commonly in the visual than in other sense modalities. Some perceptual illusions are universal and found in all individuals. For example, the rail tracks appear to be converging to all of us. These illusions are called universal illusions or permanent illusions as they do not change with experience or practice. Some some other illusions some other illusions seem to vary from individual to individual. These are called personal illusions. So, first in this is geometrical illusion. Muller Lyer illusion has been shown in this figure in this book in the figure 5.16. All of us perceive line A as shorter than line B, although both the lines are equal. This illusion is experienced even by children. There are some studies that suggest that even animals experience this illusion more or less like us. Besides Muller-Lye illusions, several other visual illusions are experienced by human beings, also birds and animals. So the illusion can be seen by the illusion of vertical and horizontal lines. Although both the lines Although both the lines are equal, we perceive the vertical line as longer than the horizontal line. Apparent movement illusion. This illusion is perceived This illusion is perceived when some motionless pictures or are projected one after another at an appropriate rate. This illusion is referred to as Ch-5 phenomenon. When we see moving pictures in a cinema show, we are influenced by this kind of illusion. The succession of flickering electrical lights also generate this illusion. This phenomenon can be experimentally studied with the help of an instrument by presenting two or more lights in a succession. For the experience of this illusion, Wertheimer had reported the presence of appropriate level of brightness, size, spatial gap, and temporal contiguity of different lights to be important. In the absence of these, the light points will not appear as moving. They will appear either as one point or as different points appearing one after another without an experience of motion. Experience of illusions indicates that people do not always perceive the world as it is. Instead, they engage in its construction, sometimes based on the features of stimuli and sometimes based on the experiences in a given environment. Sociocultural influences on perception. Sociocultural influences on perception. Several psychologists have studied the processes of perception in different sociocultural settings. The questions they try to answer through these studies are: does perceptual organization of people living in different cultural settings take place in an uniform manner? Are the perceptual processes universal or they vary across different cultural settings? Because we know people living in different parts of the world look different, many psychologists hold the view that their ways of perceiving the world must be different in some respects. So we are already familiar with Muller-Lyer and vertical horizontal illusion figures. Psychologists have used these figures with several groups of people living in Europe, Africa, and many other places. Segali, Campbell, and Herskovits carried out the most extensive study of illusion susceptibility by comparing samples from remote African villages and Western urban settings. It was found that African subjects showed greater susceptibility to horizontal vertical illusion, whereas Western subjects showed greater susceptibility to muller line illusion. Similar findings have been reported in other studies also. Living in dense forests, the African subjects regularly experienced the verticality, for example, long trees, and developed a tendency to overestimate it. The Westerners who lived in an environment characterized by right angles developed a tendency to underestimate the length of lines characterized by enclosure, for example, arrowhead. This conclusion has been confirmed in several studies. It suggests that the habits of perception are learned differently in different cultural settings. In some studies, people living in different cultural settings have been given pictures for the identification of objects and interpretation of depth or other events represented in them. Hudson did a seminal study in Africa and found that people who had never seen pictures had great difficulty in recognizing objects depicting in them and in interpreting depth cues. For example, superimposition. It was indicated that informal instruction in home and habitual exposure to pictures were necessary to sustain the skill of pictorial depth perception. Sinha and Mishra have carried out several studies on pictorial perception using a variety of pictures with people from diverse cultural settings, such as hunters and gatherers living in forests, agriculturalists living in villages, and people employed and living in cities. Their studies indicate that interpretation of pictures is strongly related to cultural experiences of people. While people in general can recognize familiar objects in pictures, those less exposed to pictures have difficulty in the interpretation of actions or events depicted in them. So, now we summarize the whole sub chapter 5, what we have all understood in this chapter. Knowledge of our internal and external world becomes possible with the help of senses. Five of them are external senses and two are internal senses. The sense organs receive various stimuli and send them in the form of neural impulses to specialized areas of brain for interpretation. Vision and audition are the two most widely used senses. Rods and cones are the receptors for vision. Rods function in low intensities of light, whereas cones function at high intensities of light. They are responsible for achromatic and chromatic vision, respectively. Light and dark adaptations are two interesting phenomena of the visual system. Hue, saturation, and brightness are the basic dimensions of color. Sound serves as stimulus for auditory sensations, loudness, pitch, and timbre. Timbre are the properties of sound. Organ of cotta located in the basilar membrane is the chief organ of hearing. Attention is a process through which we select certain information by filtering out many others that appear to be irrelevant at a given moment of time. Activation, concentration, and search are important properties of attention. Selective and sustained attention are two major types of attention. Divided attention is evident in the case of highly practiced tasks in which there is much automaticity of information processing. The span of attention is the magical number of 7 plus and minus 2. Perception refers to the process of interpretation and informed construction of the information received from sensory organs. Human beings perceive their world in terms of their motivations, expectations, cognitive styles, and cultural background. Form perception refers to the perception of a visual field set off from rest of the field by visible contours. The most primitive form of organization takes place in the form of figure ground segregation. Gestalt psychologists have identified several principles that determine our perceptual organizations. The image of an object projected onto the retina is two-dimensional. Three-dimensional perception is a psychological process that depends on correct utilization of certain monocular and binocular cues. Perceptual constancies refer to invariance of our perceptions of an object seen from any position and in any intensity of light. There is good evidence for size, shape, and brightness constancies. Illusions are the examples of non-veridical perceptions. They refer to misperceptions resulting from misinterpretation of information received by our sensory organs. Some illusions are universal, while others are more personal and cultural specific. Sociocultural factors play an important role in our perceptions by generating differential familiarity with and salience of stimuli, as well as certain habits of perceptual inference among people.